Hi, Psych fans. Sorry I'm having some technical problems today. But what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some of the major concepts in behaviorism. Again, a big branch in psychology. If you ever heard of something called the nature-nurture controversy, this is a dilemma, debate in this field about anything really. Your personality, your intelligence, your skills, the way you act. How and why did that happen? All right, how did you get to be like that? All right, the nature side of that controversy means genetics, talking about you're born that way because of genes. The nurture side is really behaviorists. And pure behaviorists were 100% on the nurture side, meaning that everything about you is picked up from experience. You have learned it from your environment and the experience. So those are key words in behaviorism. And the early behaviorists like Watson and Thorndike and Skinner honestly believed this wholeheartedly. That some of them actually made a claim that you could get an infant and, the tabula rasa, the infant is a blank slate. And just by the way that you form their environment, you can have them grow up to be whatever you want. So things like skills and inborn traits and personality factors, none of that matter to them. I think today most people realize that traits and most things that we do are a combination of things. They're not just one thing. They're not just genetic and they're not just learned. It's a combination. All right, but in the early days of behaviorism, they were pretty much purists, and we're going to talk about it from that angle. What exactly did they mean? One of the reasons I think this chapter is difficult for a lot of students is because of the terminology. The concepts are really not that hard, all right, but it's the terms that we're using. But don't get bogged down by them. I'm going to try to give you examples and talk you through some of these, and I think you'll see, if you think about it in real life examples, how this works. All right, when you see the words conditioning, we're going to talk about the two major kinds of learning here: classical and operant conditioning. Conditioning more or less just means learning. So when you, again, hear keywords like learning, experience, environment, we are talking about behaviorism. All right. One of the best ways to keep these two straight, these two different kinds of learning, is not to use a cuss word, and I apologize if that bothers anyone. All right, but it's a kind of a mnemonic way of keeping these straight. ASS, associating stimuli. That's what you're doing in classical conditioning. All right, classical conditioning, the response, the behavior, is a behavior that, at least at the beginning, is more or less reflexive. A lot of times they're automatic, unconscious, things like reflexes. But what happens is, in classical conditioning, the person or the animal starts to show those behaviors to odd stimuli, to stimuli that other organisms wouldn't react that way to. All right, and that's where the learning comes in. All right, so let's talk through what Ivan Pavlov did. And Ivan Pavlov used dogs. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about that dog studies. All right, what you may not know is that Ivan Pavlov didn't start out as a psychologist. Most of the early ones really didn't. It was a new field. So Ivan Pavlov started out as really a physiologist. He was studying digestion, and he was using dogs as subjects. And as far as I know, no dogs were injured, although if you see the film in one of the videos I posted for you, it looks a little creepy. He had these dogs in the lab, and they were hooked up to these little buckets and tubes to see and measure how much salivation they did. Salivation is not learned, all right? This is what Pavlov eventually called an unconditioned response. All right, unconditioned stimulus that gets salivation going is food. All right, this is true for humans as well. Right? But if you present food to a dog and they start eating it, they will salivate naturally. That is not a learned response. They're not sitting there thinking about, well, should I salivate to that milk bone? They just will. Just like if somebody puts a donut in front of you and you start eating it or thinking about it, you're going to salivate. That is not learned. So that is what we call an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Just happens naturally. But what Pavlov found inadvertently in his studies was something very, very interesting. And he found that what happened was the dogs in his study started to salivate even when food wasn't around. They were salivating to anything they had learned to associate with food. So the sound of the footsteps of people coming in, looking at Pavlov's, seeing their food dish, anything that those dogs had learned went with food, Now they started to salivate with those things, even when there wasn't any food there. This is what he found interesting. So that's what he started to study. And what he's very well known for is obviously the bells. Okay? So what Pavlov started to do, all right, if you think about this, if you have a dog or any other animal, like I have my cat right over here, I may bring her into some other ones here, but if I do this to my cat and ring this bell, she's looking at me like, what is that? But she's not salivating, at least I can't tell, I don't think she is, all right, because nobody naturally salivates to a bell, all right? That's not something we do, unless what? You're one of Pavlov's dogs, and he started to put them together. Every time he showed you food, he rang a bell. Food, bell, food, bell, food, bell. And what happens after a while? Dogs were salivating only to this. They had associated it. To them, this was a signal. It meant the food was coming, and they automatically started to salivate. So as you can see, this is a basically passive kind of learning. The dogs weren't really doing anything. They were hanging there and associating things. All right, this is what is known as classical conditioning. And at the end, to make it again more complicated, the food is again unconditioned stimulus. The bell, a conditioned stimulus. And both of them elicit a response. But now, when the response is coming to this is called a conditioned response. How can you tell the difference? Well, think about it this way. Again, a dog, a cat, even a person hearing bells are not salivating. But only the ones that have learned to put it together. So this is conditioned or learned. All right. Now, what happens if I start, let's say this dog becomes adjusted and is good with this and learns and now salivates only to this, even without any food. All right, what happens if I try a different kind of bell? All right, as long as the bell is similar enough, this dog will salivate to it. This is a process that Pavlov called generalization. All right, think about something. We have a lot of things that are classically conditioned, especially phobias and fears and things that we react to with stress. Think about a fire alarm. All right, when the fire alarm goes off in a building, we might tense up because you've learned that it means a fire could be there. It could be some kind of an emergency. All right, if an alien or someone who never heard bells before heard a bell, they might be a little startled by the sound, but they wouldn't put any meaning to it. They would have no idea what it means. All right. Fire alarms don't sound exactly the same in every building, but they're close enough that you know what they are. That's generalization. You react to them all the same way. On the other hand, if I tried a different kind of bell, let's say I blew an air horn in his face, if he were real, he'd probably bite me. All right, he's not going to salivate to that because it doesn't sound anything like the original one. So same thing with a fire alarm. All right, if all of a sudden, somebody over the announcements or you hear a rooster making a noise, you're not going to react to that like it's a fire alarm. It doesn't sound anything like it. All right, so that's what we call discrimination. You have discriminated among the stimuli. All right. Notice that these are words that obviously have other meanings in other ways, but in behaviorism they mean something very, very specific. All right. Let's say that after a while this dog has learned to salivate to the bells, but I stop giving him food. Now what happens? Eventually, after a period of time, the dog will unlearn the response. This is something called extinction. Some of you may be thinking this with a fire alarm. Because they've rung all the time since you were kids, and I'm hoping most or all of the time they've been false alarms, some of you may find you don't even react to it anymore because now you've unlearned the fact that it could mean something important, and you might think, oh, it's just a regular old fire alarm. When we eventually talk about treatments for disorders, classical conditioning is really, really important because a lot of times our phobias are classically conditioned. For example, people who have been maybe traumatized, sometimes we often react to them too on a very visceral, deep, unconscious level and aren't even aware of it. For example, let's say as a very young child, maybe you experienced the death of a loved one in a hospital setting and it was traumatic, but maybe you don't really remember it. You might have pushed it down. You were very young. You don't have a vivid memory of it, but on an unconscious level, there's triggers. So now when you walk into a place that smells like a hospital and you smell the antiseptic, you might feel yourself get tense and anxious. That's an example of classical conditioning. Very strong, very powerful. Okay, but it is not the only kind of learning. All right, there is another kind of learning involved that is called operant. Operant conditioning is a more active. This is based on basically trial and error. All right, if you think about it when you were a young child and maybe you did mazes, or maybe even as an adult you go through a corn maze, how do you do it? You don't just sit there and naturally know what to do. You do what? You go a certain way, or you try something, and if it works, you continue it. If it doesn't, you stop. That's trial and error. That is the basis for B.F. Skinner's idea of what he calls operant conditioning. All right, it is based on consequences of actions. So it's not just passively associating things here. What it is an action and a consequence. If the consequence is something that we want, we keep doing it. If the consequence is something that we don't want, we are going to stop. That is the premise of operant, and that is it in its most simplistic form. Now, when we start to actually examine behaviors, though, it gets a little bit hairy, because sometimes things that we think might be reinforcing or a positive thing may be negative for certain people. For example, if you think about a teacher in an elementary school, and there's a child in there who's acting up in the back, maybe they're in the back of the room, they're acting up and they're acting up and they're acting up. And I, as the teacher, maybe I yell at them or give them demerits and I get them detentions. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, all these are negative consequences that after a while, this kid should stop. But they don't. Why not? Because I think they're negative. If I were a kid, I don't want to be yelled at and punished all the time. But maybe that kid doesn't care, because why? He's getting attention. And to him, those things are really positive things in a way. They're giving him something he wants, and that's why he keeps going. So one of the reasons that this is a little confusing to some students is because you have to think about it from the point of view of the subject. Because a consequence that might be rewarding to one, maybe not to someone else. All right, so Skinner did most of his studies, again, using animals, and he devised this little contraption that's come to be known as a Skinner box. And he put little animals in there, rats, pigeons. In the video, there's pigeons, but when I was a student, we used to use rats. And we did not hurt them. No animals were hurt. I mean, I guess you could do that, but we, in our version, did not do that. But again, this is an operant conditioning, is a very active kind of learning. This is what happens. Put a rat in a Skinner box. Skinner boxes are very small. Again, you can see the videos of them. There's pretty much nothing to do in there except a little lever. Rats are very, very smart, and I swear they have ADHD, and they're going to be bouncing all over in there. After a while, they are inadvertently going to push, or maybe on purpose because they're bored, they'll push the lever. Okay, for whatever reason, they will push it. When that happens, one of two things is going to happen. Either they were going to get a food pellet or an electric shock. Now, again, I didn't do the electric shocks, but other people did. All right, but let's say they get the food pellet, which they like. What are they going to do? Continue to push the lever. It was a consequence they wanted. They're going to keep on doing it. On the other hand, what if they get an electric shock? They are going to stop. Again, rats are smart. All right, it won't take long for them to learn, hey, this hurts, I'm not going to push this stupid lever anymore. Or, hey, I get fed, I'm going to push it, and they'll start doing it frantically because they know that the food is coming. This is the key to operant conditioning. All right, his terms. Anything that makes the behavior continue. So in the rat case, the food is what he calls a reinforcement, or we might call a reward. All right, these are anything that keeps the behavior going. Anything that stops it is a punishment. Right? Now again, what is a reinforcement and a punishment can vary from person to person. So that's why there's a lot of gray areas here. All right, but anything that keeps behavior going, like in my example with the student in the classroom, what I think is a punishment, giving detentions and yelling at him in front of his peers, is actually working as a reward. All right, so we have to, think about what is the target behavior. If it continues, whatever it is that we're doing to those, the consequences are acting as reinforcements. If the behavior is stopping, it is a punishment. Okay, now a couple of things here to make, again, that was very simplistic. In real life, things are not usually quite that simple. But we'll talk about the differences of what he calls positive and negatives of both. When we talk about positive and negative punishments and reinforcements, the positive and negative does not mean a good and bad. It is not a value judgment. So you have to get out of that mindset. What it means is giving or taking. Positive means you give it to the subject. So if I'm giving him food, that's positive. but also giving a shock is a positive. All right, so those are the things that we have to think about when we're talking about this. All right, so for example, if you have a job and you get a paycheck, that is a positive reinforcement. All right, it keeps you going to your work. But other things might too. Maybe the fact that you get praise, or you get people giving you social support or whatever. Those are positive reinforcements. They keep you going. All right, a negative reinforcer is something that I'm taking from the animal or from you to get you to do something. Nagging is a good example. Poking him with a prod to get him to go somewhere. I take that away so taking it away is the negative, but now he does what I want. He went over there, or you did your homework. I stopped nagging. All right, a positive punishment is something I give you to stop a behavior. So that would mean, in olden days, people would spank a child. Doesn't sound very positive, and it isn't. All right, but it got a child to stop a behavior, potentially. All right, if a cop gives you a ticket to stop speeding, that is a positive punishment. It is getting you to stop. A negative punishment is something I take to get you to stop a behavior. So if I have a teenager who's out too late and I want them to stop breaking curfew, what do? Take their car keys, take their privileges. All right. This concept can also get confusing because a lot of times in real life, behaviors and consequences are a little of both. They can be mixed. Like, for example, if I take a 4-year-old and I give him a timeout to get him to stop, am I getting him to stop a behavior? Or I want him to do a positive behavior? Am I taking his privileges? Am I giving him time to himself? It could be looked at different ways. So positive and negatives are things I'm not in an intro class going to be too concerned about, but what I want you to understand is the reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcements make something continue. A punishment, stops the behavior. The last term here is extinction. Extinction happens in operant conditioning as well, and what that means is the behavior stops. So in Skinner box, I stop giving treats, no more treats. After a while, he'll stop. That's extinction. After a while, that behavior will stop. It will go away. All right. Now here's one last thing here. Let's say Irad is in here and he gets a pellet every single time he pushes it, and then all of a sudden, no more food. He will stop quickly. But what if I trained him, I conditioned him by giving him a pellet every so often? Guess what? When the food dries up, he doesn't know that. He will keep pushing more and more and more, hoping that eventually he's going to get food. That is what Skinner called a partial type of those are schedules of reinforcement, partial reinforcement, which are much more effective than continuous. So this is why with kids, for example, constant praise can backfire. Because as soon as you forget to praise them or you get busy and you don't, what happens? Behavior stops. So we want to give it out enough that it keeps them doing something, but not so much that they kind of get so used to it that as soon as it stops, they stop. Same thing with money and other things. Reinforcements work best when they're a little scarce, but they're there enough to keep you doing something. All right. So, very, very quickly here, that's a good overview. Again, more passive, more active kind of learning. All right, but in the behaviorist minds, everything we're doing has been learned in one of these methods, or most of these. All right, the other one is observational learning, which is pretty easy, observing what other people do and copying them. So I think that's one that isn't that hard. But Bandura did that study with the Bobo doll. If you looked at that clown was a little bit creepy. One last thing here. This is my Bobo doll. He's a lot friendlier. I probably would not punch him, even though I would punch the clown. But observational learning, we often learn by watching others, not only by copying their behaviors, but also watching whether they get reinforced and punished. If they do something like they get a lottery ticket, what do we want to do? That wins, we want to go right back to that same place and get one. That's called vicarious reinforcement. Likewise, if we see someone ahead of us stopped and gets a ticket for speeding, we slow down. Vicarious punishment. All right, so there you go. Behaviorism in about 20 minutes. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. Adios.